Love it, hate it, or somewhere in between, it's pretty easy to see the appeal of the harem genre as well as why it's such a staple in anime as a whole. And why wouldn't it be? It has all the ingredients of a hit. A blank slate protagonist, an army of cute girls who love him, and all kinds of heart-pounding romantic encounters. Harem is a genre that I can only describe as turbulent. At once producing deep and intriguing stories about complex characters and ideas, as well as producing vapid schlock so artistically bankrupt that it's actually offensive. More often than not, though, it produces fairly middling content that neither dazzles nor disgusts. There are many attributes that make harems unique and distinct from their contemporaries, but these qualities actually directly contribute to some of its biggest and most off-putting flaws when put into practice. I'm going to go through some of the biggest ones I've noticed in all my time watching harem anime and critique them to illustrate how they may be holding the genre back. It's my contention that, whether intentionally or not, harem anime is designed to disappoint you, and as a former fan of the genre, here are some of the ways I'd like to see that change. The protagonist in most harem anime is deliberately as vague and nondescript as possible. They're typically average in appearance, with an average personality, and with the exception of plot-convenient superpowers, they're average in fitness and intelligence as well. This is all done so that the viewer can easily project themselves onto the main character and enjoy his harem vicariously as they watch, without any sort of growth or development of an established character getting in the way. In a vacuum, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but its overall prevalence in harem anime means that there's a staggering amount of shows being produced that have a protagonist-shaped hole in them. While that's not to say some side characters can't convey compelling stories of their own, they're supposed to support an overall narrative, not carry or make up for one. The amount of harem heroes taking a back seat while their story plays out around them indicates a trend of forgettable characters in forgettable shows. Because of the absence of an actual character, these protagonists are just lifeless shells, typically with more negative traits than positive. The most you can say about the vast majority of them is that they're kind of nice, but incredibly perverted, which is handled in so many ways. The joke is that he's a pervert. The joke is that he's a pervert. The joke is that he's a pervert, get it? The possibilities are literally endless, so why do we constantly rely on this? It's suffocating. Again, this isn't to say that perverted characters can't be funny or entertaining on their own, but it's such low-hanging fruit for writing a character, and it shouldn't be the only crutch writers lean on. With all that said, there's a trend among harem protagonists that is much, much worse than just being a perv, and that's them being dense, which is something that I'll return to later. Many harems have an interesting premise that go on to set the stage for their stories. From seeing flags that dictate your relationship with someone, to being cursed to turn into a cat, to being brutally murdered in the first episode, there's really no end to the interesting universes that these shows propose. It's such a shame then that so many choose to prioritize panty shots and harem antics over what could easily be a stimulating and entertaining story otherwise. Harems are well and truly a genre of wasted potential, because their writers seem to believe that an interesting story and a harem are mutually exclusive. You only need to look to shows like The World God Only Knows to realize that not only does the main character's harem not have to detract from the story, it can even enhance it by introducing intricate and engaging narrative stakes. It also shows that harems can succeed in being interesting and funny without relying on cheap and lazy attempts at humour by falling on cliché and unfunny gags. You know the ones. They weren't funny the first time, and they're not funny now. Even so, shows that are entirely focused on their harem and have crude and sexual humour can actually be quite entertaining too. It's all to do with how a series frames itself and how it sets audience expectation. If a show is honest about just being a silly comedy and doesn't try to bait the viewer with a tenuous and clumsy story, it skirts plenty of the frustrations that so many harems cause. It's why shows like High School DxD stand head and shoulders above something like Mark and Key, which displays each of these problems like it's going down a checklist. High School DxD is self-aware enough to embrace and lampoon its DNA as a standard harem show, which means it's not afraid to tell jokes at its own expense, and that it's not trying to pass off as high art. Doing this perfectly sets viewer expectations at a reasonable level, and lets them decide if they want to come along for the ride. A struggle with expectations seems to lie at the heart of the genre itself. There's a fundamental disconnect between how shows present themselves in their first few episodes and how they ultimately end up later. In so many harems, the girls slot lazily into pre-established character types. It stifles any potential for them to develop or otherwise behave outside the rigid cliches that the genre demands. Some shows play around with these stereotypes for comedic effect, parodying and poking fun at them, and that's definitely better than conforming to them outright. But I can't help but wonder how it would benefit the genre if harem works would try to do away with them entirely and have their heroines stand on their own merits. These expected and traditional character archetypes are no doubt comfortable for fans and creators alike, but after seeing enough of them, the facade slips away and they're quickly revealed to be bland stand-ins for actual characters until you're just watching boring caricatures go through the motions. Having multiple girls of varying archetypes means a show can reach a wider audience by appealing to specific and underrepresented niches. But this intrinsic draw to harem anime means that in order to preserve interest of a diverse audience with mutually exclusive desires, a harem protagonist will rarely choose a girl to avoid alienating people whose favourite heroine didn't get picked. And this brings me to my final gripe about harem anime as a whole. Despite all the problems I've laid out up until this point, by far the worst of them all is the fact that harem anime is absolutely terrified of consequences and will avoid them at all cost. For all the narrative threads a series will set up, and for all the relationships that get teased, nothing ever comes from it. And that's on purpose. It is that fear of moving forward and committing to a potentially controversial narrative decision that caused the creation of harem anime's biggest plague. The dense protagonist. Dense protagonists are about the worst kind you can get, especially in a harem setting. It's an obvious and cynical trope designed because writers realized they couldn't continue a love story indefinitely without anyone acting on it, without fans getting bored. So, to help stagnate any kind of traction a relationship or narrative is gaining in a series, and in order to artificially prolong the competition between the heroines without it ever coming to a head, the dense protagonist was born. This stereotype was deliberately manufactured in order to give the illusion of progress and development, such as having a heroine confess only for the hero to not hear or misunderstand the confession, while simultaneously making him too oblivious or cowardly to initiate anything more than friendship either. At almost every stage of a plot and character building, harems tend to kneecap their own potential because of the safety that colouring inside the lines affords. The bottom line is that protagonists will always be more engaging to watch when their blunders and failings aren't due to some arbitrary stupidity assigned to them, but because they're a fleshed out character with desires and flaws. Conforming to expectations and tropes within a genre don't automatically detract from the works within it. It's just that in the case of harems they so often do, because it's easier to rely on tried and true methods or pander to audiences, instead of taking a chance on telling a distinct and original story. Harem anime gets a bad rap among anime fans, and plenty of that criticism is completely warranted. Despite that, some of my favourite shows fall into this genre, and I want to see it succeed by shedding its self-imposed limitations and rely less on cliché and safe production choices.